European Union says it has reduced funding for the African Union mission in Somalia because of financial constraints. On Thursday, African Union officials met with AMISOM partners in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa, to see how to avoid waste and duplication of functions in Somalia. The mission may now be forced to concentrate on airstrikes and not ground operations to minimize expenses. AMISOM partners include the United Kingdom, the European Union, France, the United States, China, and the United Nations. Let's get more on this developing story, and I'm joined by our correspondents Abdulaziz Bello in Mogadishu and Kevin Ozebek in Brussels. Let's start with you, Abdulaziz. Now, restructuring funding for AMISOM was discussed at the just concluded African Union summit. This cut in funding, though, what does this mean for the war against Al-Shabaab?
Well, Beatrice, you're right. The funding shortfall is a big blow for the African Union forces here, known as AMISOM, who are helping the Somali government in the fight, actually against the Al-Shabaab. So technically, what experts here are saying is that this announcement comes at a very wrong time, in the sense that AMISOM itself is suffering from three major setbacks. That the militant group launched 3 deadly attacks on its bases. Now, these bases were in the Lower Shabelle region and the Gedo region. Now, what AMISOM is actually trying to recover from is the 3 attacks on its bases. Now, this is in Lego, in the Lower Shabelle region, where Burundian soldiers were attacked. The second attack took place in Janale, and the third attack on El Ade. This is in the Kenyan military base camp that has been viewed as the most deadliest against the Kenyan forces and the AMISOM forces here in Somalia. So technically, experts are saying that this announcement comes at a very wrong time. Another thing that will likely to affect, other than the fight against the Al-Shabaab, is the fact that the soldiers who are fighting the forces will not have the morale to continue to fight the militants, in the sense that you find at the end of the day the AMISOM soldiers will just be similar like to the Somali soldiers, who always complain rather about the lack of funding and lack of allowances. So this will likely to have a likely influence on the fight against the Al-Shabaab. So another thing that it will also have an effect on is the ground operations that AMISOM is launching. So Somali government forces want the AMISOM forces to launch the operation, but AMISOM will be limited in this case due to the funding shortfall. So technically, they'll be forced to rely on aerial support, like you've said. Now, this is also another major issue, because not every troop contributing countries has the power to the aerial capabilities. Rather, only Ethiopia and Kenya have these capabilities. So basically, these will be the forces that will be in charge of liberating more towns and villages in southern Somalia.
Kevin, let me bring you in on this conversation. Now, the war on terror is a global war, from the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb to ISIL to Al-Shabaab in East Africa. When you reduce funding like the EU has done for Al-Shabaab, for AMISOM forces, and operations are affected, does the European Union not see that this will affect East Africa, but also it will affect the rest of the world?
Well, the EU says this program, this mission in Somalia, is not sustainable. It's just becoming more and more expensive every single year. And the EU says it's already spending a good chunk of money to support this mission. In fact, since 2007, more than €1 billion from the EU have been poured into this mission. And the EU says that it's not really that concerned that this mission will fall apart because of the lack of funding. It believes the mission will be able to stay in attack. And at the end of the day, the EU says there's only so much money to go around. It's also trying to support the fight against Boko Haram in West Africa. And the EU also says that it has to make sure that it can keep a pool of money together to be able to fund and to be able to help out for any other crisis that may suddenly erupt on the continent.
All right, Abdulaziz, this is, of course, going to be a major source of concern for the Somali government. Has the Somali government responded to that pronouncement by European Union officials cutting AMISOM funds?
Well, Beatrice, authorities here in Somalia have not yet issued official comment on the recent comment by the EU. So what experts here are actually saying is that Somalia, during the the African Union Heads of State Summit that took place in Ethiopia. Somalia met with the African Union officials and AMISOM officials, and they talked about the need to restart the offensive against the Al-Shabaab. So basically, Somalia feels at this stage it needs to be to have the upper hand in the fight against the Al-Shabaab. Now, technically, the situation on the ground is different. It's AMISOM forces and the Somali government forces that have pulled out of a string of towns in southern Somalia due to the Al-Shabaab attacks on Somali military bases and African Union bases. So definitely that has been an issue here for authorities. And what Somali authorities are also saying is that since the country is headed towards elections, it needs to have the upper hand in the fight against the Al-Shabaab so that the militant group will not have the capability to mobilize itself and launch deadly attacks on the Somali government bases. So what experts here are saying is that during the meeting that will take place in Istanbul later this week, Somali authorities need to present to the European Union and the UN the need to fund AMISOM forces and Somali government to be able to better fight and control Somalia from the militants.
Well, Kevin, as you mentioned there earlier, the European Union has been rather stretched financially, but has the European Union given alternative ways in which terrorism can be defeated with reduced funds?
Well, the EU says from this point going forward that it will help the African Union try to find other sources of funding for this mission in Somalia. So it will still be giving a lot of attention to Somalia, and also it really is heavily invested in this project. So the last thing it wants to see after investing more than €1 billion in this project is to see it fail and wither away. So the EU is giving its commitment, its promise to the AU that it will help find other sources of income, other sources of money to keep this program afloat and to make sure that this program is successful in defeating Al-Shabaab.
Right, Kevin Ozebek in Brussels and Abdulaziz Bello joining us there from Mogadishu. To you both, thank you.